So we're going to talk about first the overlap between the neuroscience research that you specialize in and all the data science approaches that you've brought to that. So you have a PhD in neuroscience and you've been a professor of neuroscience now for over
Mhm.
10 years. Your lab focuses on how brain regions communicate and how these communications change due to development, aging, or disease. Do you have any particularly surprising or maybe even counterintuitive findings from your research that you could relay to us in this audio only format?
Yeah, we have some pretty fun new stuff that we are actually presenting um, in 5 days. It just happens to be at a conference in Chicago, the Society for Neuroscience conference. It's 33,000 people attend this conference every year. It's massive. All over the world, everybody comes in, all of these neuroscientists trying to solve the brain. And one of the PhD students working in my lab, Blanca Martin Burgos, is presenting some of our new research that we're hoping to send out for peer review before the end of the year on action potentials. So, for those of you not familiar, but probably at least passingly familiar with the idea that we've got neurons in the brain cells, and they communicate using electrical signaling. And there's about 86 billion or so of these neurons that are in this just crazy, messy, noisy biochemical, electrical soup. And somehow that all gives rise to everything that we think and feel and do. And, the architecture or presumed architecture of the brain has given rise to artificial neural networks, right? They're inspired by the brain's neural networks. That's why they're called artificial neural networks. And that's given rise to the modern deep learning AI revolution. And the presumption in the field is that these electrical signaling units in the brain are binary all or nothing spikes, uh, codified into what's referred to as the all or nothing law. These neurons communicate using these binary signals, and the computational neuroscience community picks that up and says, well, we can convert these into binary codes, and this must be how the brain operates. And what Blanca is showing in our research is that that's probably not true. They're
Hmm,
probably not all or nothing binary signals.
no
Um,
kidding. That
yeah,
is wild.
if you zoom in enough, they look binary because we sample them at 20,000 samples per second in order to sort of record them. And 20,000 samples per second, these signals last about 1 millisecond. If you just do the quick arithmetic, that means that there's 20 data points, approximately, more or less, that give rise to the sort of spike shape that we see. And people then just say, well, because they're all or nothing, we'll just keep track of the timestamp of when it occurred and save a lot of hard drive space so we don't have to record 20 to 40,000 samples per second. Newer technologies, though, allow us to sort of oversample in the temporal domain. So we could sample at 200,000 samples per second. And when you do that, these 1 millisecond long action potentials now have 200 uh, or more data points. And when you do that, you actually see that there's variability that is not random, but seems to be, at least according to our work, systematic. So action potentials exponentially rise very quickly in time. We're talking about fractions of a millisecond, and then exponentially decay. And that's dominated by known biophysical properties. Ion channels open, ion channels close, and those cause the flow of currents that give rise to the shape of these action potentials. But if an action potential happens to decay faster, then it's like reset more, and it's what's called the refractory period, allows it to then signal again faster. And so each individual action potential's waveform seems to be not binary, but governed by this type of inputs that it's receiving. And that sort of resets the time that the next action potential can occur. So we can predict when a next action potential is going to occur based upon the shape of the current spike. And so, if that is true, then we sort of have to rethink about what are some of the computational and neural codes that the brain uses. These aren't binary codes, but they're actually more analog codes. And to us, the most exciting thing is spiking neural networks that are meant to mimic and be more biologically plausible to the brain don't actually perform anywhere nearly as well as more modern deep learning architectures that rely on neurons that have non-binary activation functions, so like ReLU and GELU and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
But it appears the brain doesn't have binary activation functions either. The neurons in the brain actually appear to also be non-binary. And so then the next step that we're trying to figure out is, can we learn what the actual different set of activation functions that the brain is using and build those into artificial neural network architectures to be more biologically inspired. So, there's a zoo of activation functions that artificial neural networks use, and they're mostly kind of ad hoc. People sort of throw things together and see what works. I think there's a review paper that came out recently on Archive, and it's like 200 to 400 activation functions that are being used. And it's just kind of, we use what works. But if we can actually instead figure out what the set of biologically inspired activation functions that neurons use looks like, can we then build those into artificial neural network architectures? And does that improve how they learn? Does it improve energy efficiency and so on? So anyway, that's sort of the big new exciting area of work that's going on in the lab. And yeah, hopefully look out for the next couple of months in peer review.
That is exciting. If I try to recap back to you some of what you just said, so I have now been teaching for many years, and I also did a neuroscience PhD. And so to me, I took that law as law that this was an all or nothing action potential, and that they're kind of all the same. And I guess it isn't surprising that when you zoom in more closely, like you can now with this high temporal resolution, you can in fact see that there is some variance in these action potentials.
Mhm.
And the whole time that you were describing that, that made me think of how in modern neural networks, unlike the original designs from the 1950s, like the perceptron,
Right.
that only had a binary output,
Yes.
how we figured out over time, and when I say we, standing on the shoulders of giants, people before I was born figured out that you could have, like a sigmoid activation function, which is continuous, or tanh, or now, as you said, ReLU is very popular these days, and derivatives of that. And all of those have a range of values. You can move continuously
Mhm.
across them. Some are unbounded even. And so it's, I guess it would make sense that if we see that in neural networks, they learn so much better when they're unbounded like that, I guess it shouldn't be too surprising that neural networks actually do have that kind of variance, that kind of subtlety. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense
Yeah,
to me.
I mean, there's a lot of opportunity here, right? And so I come from not a single neuron recording background, right? Those are the physiologists that do that. And actually, if you go into like the research that people who do these single neuron recordings, not computational neuroscientists, but like the physiologists that are really trying to understand like the physiology of action potentials. Apparently, it's very well known that action potentials aren't actually binary amongst that community. But for whatever reason, the community in circles that I tend to sort of live in, which are the computational theoretical neuroscience side, um, it's like the spherical cow. We don't want to worry about all the details, right? We just say it's close enough to binary that let's use that, and from that we derive these different kinds of neural codes, rate codes, and temporal codes, and population codes. But all of those are reliant on just the timing of when spikes occurred and how many per unit time. But the reality, according to the physiologists, is not that simple. Unsurprisingly, biology is never that simple, I guess. And it's mostly been presumed, though, that the variability we see in the shape of these action potentials is more or less just random noise. It's just biological noise. But what we're finding is that it is not. It is systematic and varies systematically as a function of the style of the inputs that the neuron is receiving or the nature of the inputs. And so, there's a lot of opportunity to start playing around with new ideas of like, well, what kinds of other neural codes are possible if we don't assume this binary all or nothing paradigm? And I don't know, I don't have an answer yet. I mean, this is all very new for the lab, but it's been very exciting for us because it really has been a collaboration between many different fields.